Hello and welcome to Screen Jumper, a series of video essays on the convergence of film and video games. My name is Aaron Julian, and today I want to take a look at Scarface. This 1983 Brian de Palma film is itself a remake of the 1932 Howard Hawks film by the same name. The original followed the rise and fall of a New York gangster during the height of Prohibition, and had a huge influence on the gangster subgenre. Likewise, the remake, starring Al Pacino, tracks a Cuban immigrant named Tony Montana as he climbs the ladder through the cocaine-fueled criminal underworld of 1980s Miami, and it too was a large influence on the rap and hip-hop scene. The remake shares many of the same story points, including an initial assassination, an introduction to a criminal empire, a falling out with the protagonist's mother and sister, a double-crossing, a staged phone call to uncover a traitor, the taking of a mob boss's wife, a violent shootout finale, and the protagonist having a weird thing for his sister. The remake also had Oliver Stone on board for the screenplay, which gave the story much more nuanced and complex characters than the original, not least of which is Tony Montana, brought to life by Al Pacino. The story maintained the feel of a Greek tragedy, but tossed away the ham-fisted social commentary of the original in favor of a much more subtle one. Not to mention that Scarface concludes with one of the greatest finales in movie history, which makes it puzzling why the 2006 video game adaptation, Scarface, The World Is Yours, rewrites it so that Tony actually survives. The game is a pseudo-sequel developed by Radical Entertainment and published by Sierra. And yes, the game begins with an almost shot-for-shot remake of the last scene of the movie, only the player takes control to save Tony, who subsequently loses his entire empire and spends the rest of the game gaining it back and taking revenge on his rivals. Now that it's time to evaluate Scarface the game versus Scarface the movie, I'd like to introduce a particular focus for this analysis, the concept of a spiritual successor. I find that this is one of the most important criteria to use when evaluating a video game or film adaptation. Does the adaptation embody the spirit of the original? What does that even mean? As usual, it's time for some definitions. In some ways, we all know what a spiritual successor is. BioShock is a spiritual successor to System Shock, as is Yooka-Laylee to Banjo-Kazooie, and Perfect Dark to GoldenEye 007. But why are these considered spiritual successors? As best as I understand it, a spiritual successor is a work of art made with a high degree of similarity to the spirit of another work. The spirit of the work is the elements that make it up and how those elements interact. And most importantly, it's why and for what purpose the work was made. Take a look at any of these games, and it becomes clear that the differences between original and successor are largely superficial. Films have spiritual successors as well. The Professional and Nikita, Hot Fuzz and Shaun of the Dead, even Starship Troopers and RoboCop. Speaking of Starship Troopers, you could be forgiven for thinking the film was a spiritual successor or even direct adaptation of the book, but I don't qualify it as either of those. Why? The film was made for a different reason and purpose than the book was. While on the surface the two are the same, the book is largely a right-wing crusade against the specter of hive-minded communism, and the film is a satirical lampooning of that view. The tone and intent of the film is far too different than the book to justify its status as either a spiritual successor or straight-shot adaptation. Now, with that understanding, let's evaluate Scarface the game as a candidate for being a spiritual successor to Scarface the film. The following are what I believe to be the most important elements of the original Brian de Palma film. Themes. The characters and circumstances of Scarface partially serve to explore the following themes: excess of lifestyle, greed, ambition, risk and reward, deceit, double-crossing, distrust, isolation, revenge, and, of course, violence. Tone. The tone of Scarface remains mostly serious, occasionally branching out to theatric or even excessive levels of violence, while remaining grounded in reality. It sometimes serves as social commentary, and is thus condemning, but it is nowhere near as bald-faced as the criticism found in the original 1932 film. Story. After an initial contract killing, a Cuban immigrant named Tony Montana rises through the ranks of a Miami drug cartel with his friend before succumbing to greed. In other words, a classic example of a Greek tragedy. Aesthetics. This is arguably the least important element, but it bears mentioning. The film is set in 1980s Miami and mirrors Tony's rise to power, from the refugee camp called Freedom Town, to downtown Miami, to a sophisticated nightclub, and finally, an opulent mansion. All of these elements come together to make up the spirit of Scarface. Now it's time to look at how the game managed to keep this spirit alive, if at all. An important decision any game must make as an adaptation is how to represent themes found in the original work through not only the audiovisual feedback provided by the game, but the mechanics itself, how the player actually interacts with the game. The conveyance of theme via game mechanics is a phenomenon known as thematic mechanical abstraction, as explained in this video here. Suffice it to say that representing an abstract theme with concrete game mechanics can be a challenging task to any developer, and poor design in this area can undermine the themes rather than carry them along. However, a smart use of thematic mechanical abstraction can be extremely satisfying and demonstrate one of the greatest strengths of video games as a medium. Overall, I have to say I am very impressed with the choice of mechanics used in Scarface to reflect the themes of the film. The basic design is lifted from contemporary open-world crime games, such as Grand Theft Auto Vice City and San Andreas. This was a smart move to make due to the franchise's inspiration being the Scarface film itself, but what's most impressive are the mechanics added on top of the Grand Theft Auto formula to set the Scarface game apart. This starts right at the beginning of the game. The player is able to take control of Tony and cheat death, allowing him to escape. This serves the purpose of helping the player feel in control of his own destiny in the game, and quite literally step into the shoes of Tony. Immediately afterward, the player sees a scoreboard of sorts that tallies the size of Tony's empire, only to see it immediately plummet to zero as a result of Tony escaping by the skin of his teeth. It's a small, simple thing, but it's a clever way to really drive home the point of just how much Tony has lost, especially since the movie never quantifies Tony's wealth. Although interestingly, Forbes lists him as the 13th richest fictional character, with a net worth of $1 billion. This sets an important goal for the player: do whatever it takes to get this wealth and status back, and even surpass it if you can. This scoreboard follows the player throughout the game, tallying the slow, steady progress as the player performs the game's core tasks: buying drug fronts to take over turf, killing rival gangs, acquiring mountains of cocaine to then distribute to his fronts, and rake in cash. All of these tasks fuel an ever-increasing cycle with the intent purpose to reclaim Tony's empire and exact revenge on each rival who has since moved in and carved up his territory. It's a wonderful way to remind the player of how far they have come in reaching this goal, and how much further they have yet to go. The game echoes the film's excess of lifestyle by allowing the player to slowly collect henchmen, cars, boats, weapons, furniture, collectible items, and even women, like Pokemon cards, to display as symbols of status. The player can even place these items around Tony's mansion just how they like, and watch it fill with stuff as they become more and more powerful. Yes, it's kind of cheesy and dumb, but it's about the best the game can do mechanically to echo Tony's inflating status in the film. At least purchasing these items advances the player's reputation measurement. Perhaps the best things the game gets right as mechanical abstraction are the themes of greed and ambition, risk and reward. Many interactions in the game, such as selling drugs, negotiating an exchange rate for dirty money at the bank, and talking your way out of trouble with the police, rely on a golf swing-style interaction meter. If the player stops the meter near the end, they get the most benefit: the most amount of money for drugs, the smallest exchange rate, and reduced heat from the cops. However, if the player pushes their luck too far, and the meter lands on the wrong end, they are punished with a drug deal gone wrong, a cruel 25% exchange rate, or a shootout with the police. It's this concept of pushing one's luck that is threaded so well throughout the entire game. During the course of gameplay, the player will gather heat from the cops and from rival gangs, which increase bank exchange rates and decrease the value of their drugs. The player can choose to fast-talk cops or intimidate gang members to reduce this heat and risk a physical fight doing so, or they may play it safe and pay it off directly with a heavy fine. Additionally, the core loop of the game, which consists of doing side jobs to gain contacts with drug dealers, smuggling said drugs into Miami, and then distributing those drugs to the player-owned fronts, usually lasts between 20 and 30 minutes and is highly risky, but can net between $2 and $10 million during each run, and so is highly lucrative to the player. However, a failure at any point during the mission will force the player to start all over, and if they die, they lose whatever drugs and money they have on their person, which can total in the millions if the player is not careful. The reason this risk and reward concept is so prevalent throughout the game is because it is the very thing that leads to Tony's downfall in the film. He pushed his luck too far. Alejandro Sosa orders a hit on Tony for failing to blow up a car containing a key activist against the drug trade, which Tony couldn't do because the car contained children and would violate his principles to do so, which, by the way, is a principle upheld in the game. The player cannot kill civilians. However, he is in this position in the first place because he refuses business with his regular money launderer in favor of one with an interest rate which turns out to be too good to be true, and Tony is caught in a DEA sting operation. Because he blew his luck, Tony approaches Sosa and then fails to carry out the assassination, which would help Sosa and his associates. Risk and reward mark nearly every interaction in the game, and is perhaps this game's greatest strength as an adaptation. Beyond the mechanics, the game manages to uphold many particular details of the film's aesthetics. Al Pacino lends his likeness to the game, but not his voice, which is substituted by Andrei Sogliuzzo, an alternative handpicked by Pacino himself, and honestly sounds just like he did in the film. Many locations, such as Freedom Town, Tony's Mansion, the Sunray Hotel, and the Babylon Club, look just like they did in the film, and the player can even launch into a cursing, raging, coke-fueled rampage to cut down enemies and regain health. However, I have a few points of contention with the game, some areas that I feel it failed to adapt to the spirit of the film, and even runs counter to it. My first and perhaps greatest problem is with the game's tone. While the film mostly played things straight, the game feels like a self-aware parody of itself, in a quest to see just how over-the-top and ludicrous it can become. It is far more profane and violent than the film, and that's saying a lot. The player can shoot limbs off and explode heads in a squirty, gory mess that would make Tarantino giggle with glee. Although Tony cannot shoot civilians, he is apparently fine with running them down in cars. There's even a dedicated curse button, which taunts enemies and fills Tony's rage meter faster. To put things in perspective, the film's 2-hour and 50-minute runtime includes about 22 minutes of violence, while the game's violence is almost constant. The civilians and enemies say the same weird, unfunny lines over and over again that do not match the tone of the movie.
I have to get to the bank.
Several of the missions the player must complete are frankly ridiculous, such as acting as a turret gunner defending a fishing boat collecting shark fins from pirates so that the player can then purchase a restaurant that needs the shark fins. And not to mention this nonsense. Admittedly, some of the missions are cool and fun to play, but they also don't fit with the tone of the movie. It seems that the game has taken too many cues from Grand Theft Auto, a series which is deliberately tongue-in-cheek, and such has sacrificed the film's spirit on the altar of fun, resulting in a disjointed mess. This would be forgivable if the game was in fact fun, and wasn't 20 hours longer than it needed to be, and if the core gameplay wasn't so repetitive. I must also take issue with the game's story. Now, normally I do not take a film story to be holy and inviolable, and I can understand why rewriting the movie's ending would be advantageous to allowing complete freedom to the developers, and no, I don't for a second think the game ruined the movie, nor do I think that's even possible. However, I do feel the rewrite was ultimately unnecessary, and that's why I take umbrage with it. Seeing as the Tony in the game follows pretty much the same character arc as he does in the film, and the game relies on linear progression as much as the film does, why not simply insert the optional side missions into the period of time when Tony works for Omar, or is on his own after he kills Frank and takes over the cartel? If it's for the sake of freedom in designing the game, I fail to see why rewriting the ending of the movie was necessary to accomplish this, and it feels like further disrespect for the film's spirit to hand-wave the rewrite away as a joke. I wanted so badly for this game to succeed as a spiritual successor. It does so many interesting, clever things with its mechanics to invoke the themes of the film. But its tone is completely different than the film. It runs counter to the game's mechanics, and its unnecessary mishandling of the film's story makes me question the game's motives as an adaptation. It's an open-world crime game that found novel ways to set itself apart from the Grand Theft Auto formula, but it is too different in too many critical areas to deem it a worthy spiritual successor to the film or a proper adaptation. And it's very disappointing that I have to say that. If I could improve this game, I would remove the padding so that it's about 20 hours shorter, add more variety and interesting concepts for the story missions, and offload a lot of the money-making tasks to passive gameplay. Perhaps in a Civilization-style empire management system, complete with personnel I could assign to different tasks, allowing me to focus on the gameplay I actually want to do. I would do everything I could to respect the tone and motivations of the film, and I would set the majority of the gameplay within the gaps of the movie's plot events as an alternative to rewriting the ending. The developers reportedly rewrote the film's ending because they feared players could not get invested in a character they knew would die. I disagree with that assertion. Tony Montana is canonically dead, yet he remains an unforgettable character, and so lives on in memory. Why? Because he was unique, interesting, and allowed the audience to identify with him so strongly that he has become an icon despite his death. This is what I feel the game developers failed to understand, and the goofy, ludicrous parody of Tony Montana they created simply will not be remembered in the same way because he possesses the visage of Tony, but not his soul. He is ultimately an imposter. That said, if you are a fan of Grand Theft Auto-style games and would like to see an interesting twist on the formula, Scarface: The World Is Yours may be worth a look. Similar games include, of course, the Grand Theft Auto franchise, and for what a game looks like that truly embraces lunacy in every aspect of its design, check out Saints Row the Third or Saints Row 4. Otherwise, I highly recommend the film in any circumstance. If you'd like to check out similar films, you can't go wrong with Casino, Goodfellas, The Godfather, and, if you can endure the 4-hour runtime, Once Upon a Time in America. I'd love to have you as a subscriber if you're not one already. The like and dislike buttons are there for a reason. Use them. Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, this has been a case study from Saboteur Studios. Thank you for watching.